thank you all for joining us for this panel. We've all had a chance to go through the findings of this survey. Some fascinating information in there. In the time we have, we won't be able to touch on even a fraction of what's here, but I think we want to share with you some of what we learned in reading through the survey and give you some context as to what it means to the city and what direction the city might go with some of it. Everybody in reading a document as large as this takes away something different, and I think it's important to get some sense of what each of our panelists found most interesting in the survey. Richard, maybe I'll start with you. Was there something that jumped out at you that was a surprise? What did you find most interesting as you want to single something out for me?
First of all, I think it's a great report, and the city's built on the vitality and energy of immigrants, and Vin, I think, is one of the great immigrants we've had in the last decade. What jumped out for me was what is missing, and that is discussion of a number of socioeconomic policies and questions that the report touches on, that Eddie Torres spoke about a little bit. We have the greatest disparity of income in the country, and a greater disparity of income than places like Sudan. 1/3 of our kids live in poverty, and both of those numbers are growing. And government indicates to people, and this is where it relates to the report, that they are outside of society, that they are the other, by the way public services are delivered and where things are built. Whether you're in the favelas of Brazil or in the slums of Calcutta or in the South Bronx, you are getting a different level of service and a different placement of infrastructure than down here. They get the garbage facilities, they get the criminal justice facilities, and they know it. The services, they know they're getting treated differently by police than we are. Nobody in this room, I don't think, has been stopped and frisked in the last year. They know that their hospitals, their emergency room is their doctor and the place they go for any illness, and they know we don't. So those are the kinds of things that generate the sense of other. And the most important to me is schools. Not the fact that they are distributed unevenly, because they're not, but because the quality is distributed unevenly. And even if you're on the west side here in a public school, it is better than most of the schools in New York City. There's a school I used to approach, South Bronx High School, for years, that had a sidewalk that was broken 4 years, plants growing out of it. You had to walk in the street to get to South Bronx High School, and that is not the right message we want to send to kids, except that the message again is that you are the other. So I guess what I'd encourage MAS to do next year is to expand on those elements of the report, and there are a number that deal with these socioeconomic issues.
Ruth, I know that you really dug into the numbers as a researcher, and we had an interesting conversation about half an hour ago where you told me that there were fewer variations in some areas in terms of demographics, but income is something that you cited as well as a spot where you were definitely seeing a difference in the answers from low-income New Yorkers versus upper-income New Yorkers.
That's right. And income and education obviously travel together. I had the opportunity to look at a breakdown of the answers by level of education and by income and by age. And striking to me was the fact that income and education were a larger driver than was race or ethnicity or age, which are variables that we often think of. And I want to pull out age for a second, because I think that we have some ageism embedded in our thinking about civic engagement and who has generosity of spirit toward the city. I think we have some built-in beliefs that older adults may be more resistant to moving a bus stop, moving a subway station, digging up the street to improve the neighborhood. What this data showed clearly was that older adults have lived in neighborhoods the longest, have the greatest investment in neighborhoods, participate in the cultural lives, the performance arts lives of their neighborhoods the most, and are equally as willing to see improvements in the neighborhood. And that got me to thinking about what are the human assets we're overlooking and failing to invest in. And I think the human assets that we're failing to invest in are in poor communities, are in communities of color, our assumptions about people of specific ages, our assumptions about immigrants. And what the survey showed me was this incredible generosity and willingness and hunger to see the city improved. Also, just, I know I'm done, but the strength of support for world-class colleges and universities, absolutely counterintuitive. That strength of support was very high, highest among African Americans, Hispanics, people of low income, older adults.
I'm so grateful for that cloud that just moved in.
Yes.
Elizabeth, build on that idea of infrastructure for me, and I know you take a particular interest in transportation. The New Yorkers actually seem quite tolerant of the idea that we would inconvenience them in order to make a better city a few years down the road.
That's true, and I thank you for having me here. There are differences in terms of the transportation amenities that exist throughout the city. And what we're seeing is that our communities aren't necessarily coming into Manhattan to work. They may be going from Brooklyn to the Bronx. And that we have communities that are emerging in a lot of different places that are becoming economic hubs that don't have transportation amenities. And transportation is not just transportation. It is the way that we navigate our way through the world to medical services, education, employment. And so what you have is communities that are now getting a lot of transportation amenities as a result of gentrification. But you've got communities that also don't have those things. I wanted just to say something quickly about what Richard said, because I think it's really important to underscore the fact that communities are different. When I looked at the statistics and I looked at Brooklyn, I thought it doesn't tell the whole story of Brooklyn. It doesn't tell the story of Sunset Park, of Red Hook, of East New York. When I saw the piece on culture, that surprised me. It made me think that culture was being defined in a very narrow, Eurocentric way. Because,
by that you mean that culture is going to
culture
Jazz
is
at
also
Lincoln
the way
Center,
we navigate our way through a community, and how we use a community, and how we invest in infrastructure, and how we think about what the needs of a community are.
So it's not necessarily just that I've bought tickets to a Broadway show.
Exactly. The statistic, for example, in the South Bronx, and I have a lot of love for the South Bronx. You know, South Bronx is the birthplace of hip hop and Bombi Plena in New York City, and that wasn't something that was an important part or wasn't seen as culture was very surprising to me and disturbing.
Craig, let me circle over to you with that first question. What's the one thing that jumped out of the survey?
Well, I think a lot of things jumped out, a lot which says I didn't fully understand, and we're going to talk a little bit about Richard Saul Werman's comment, which was that we need to understand before creating. I'm going to do a little critique, particularly since he's left the room, I think, does he go on? I would say we create to understand, and it's those two dynamic tensions that when they come together, I think you get a much more robust and enduring answer. But I think the one surprising element was really about the usage of our libraries, which in my view was extraordinarily high. And when we had our conversation, everybody said, no, people are going there to get computer access, they're there as a safe place to study, and that raises the question in my mind, what's the job, and this is innovation theory, what's the job a library is supposed to get done? And how will that impact in today's world where we have material scarcity but digital abundance.
So the library has adapted to our contemporary needs, but it's not necessarily the best forum to deliver those services.
May or may not be.
Okay.
And I think where it gets very, very interesting is when our institutions start to understand the process of innovation and start leveraging that and saying, okay, so is what happens in a library is typically they're trying to get people in. What happens when we start pushing the information out? Or I think you talked about the emergency room as becoming the primary care location for people who have a fever. Are there other places that we can have those functions of computer access, a safe place to study? It all comes down to education, but the one thing I think would be absolutely critical is the city really has to be one of the most digitally connected, internet access. The world is becoming mobile. If you say what's happening in the future of this city, there's three answers. It's mobile, mobile, mobile. So,
Richard, do you think the economy played a role in these results more so than it might have 5 years ago? Did you see that coloring these results?
I really didn't. I mean, it's a very positive report in almost all areas, which is great for New York. But I don't see any indication that the Great Recession, other than employment, has had a terribly negative impact on at least the questions that are in that report.
Ruth, you nodded. You agree with that assessment?
I was really surprised by how positive the respondents were. It kind of, the researcher in me got a little suspicious, actually. No offense to the excellence of all the designers of the study. I pored over the methodology. And I actually have some thoughts about why it's as positive as it is, if you want to hear them in a little while.
If we have time, I'll come back to you on that. Vin put that number up that showed the number of people who are satisfied with the balance of old buildings and new development, the number of people who think there needs to be more development, and the number who think that the old buildings are part of New York. Elizabeth, I'm curious for your thoughts on this. Is the lens of somebody in a poor neighborhood different than somebody who's over in one of these buildings on Central Park West? I wonder if somebody who is better off economically thinks of old buildings as history, and someone who is in a tough spot economically thinks of an old building as a bad apartment that they'd rather move out of.
I think that historic old buildings in our communities are in a state of continuous disrepair, and people aren't getting basic services that they need, and so they don't see it as a building that needs to be preserved. They see it as a place that isn't providing them with their basic needs. So there is a different perspective based on the way that the building is treated and as the people who are living in there are treated. So if you live on Columbus Avenue, or you live in the Upper West Side, and you're living in the Ansonia, and it's really beautiful, you're getting everything that you need. But if you're living somewhere where the plumbing is not working and you're not getting basic services, your perspective is, this is an old building and we need to do something about that. So the perspective, I think, doesn't come from a lack of appreciation for the beauty of the building, but it comes from the lack of getting basic needs met. Because in the countries that people come from, they come from very old cities and very old places that are really beautiful. So there is an appreciation for the physical structure of a community. But livability really depends on whether or not people's needs are being met.
Craig, I'd like to tap into your background in the real estate business for a minute, because the needs of real estate investors are not always aligned with the needs of the population and what the political will is. Were there areas in here where you saw some alignment there, that there are things that you could take out of this survey, that there are also opportunities for? Are developers and New Yorkers moving in the same direction?
I think it reaffirmed sort of the basic tension between modernity and tradition, where developers, it's a relatively simple, they talk about the back of the envelope is where most deals get made, but it's what's the cost per FAR, or the square feet of the office building, because if you pay X for the land and you can build an extra 20%, your land cost goes down. And I think because, and we talked, Deputy Mayor Steele talked about Midtown East and the rezoning, the land cost has been so high that that's one of the reasons that we've only seen 2 new office buildings go up. And so it's going to be very interesting. But I think there will always be that tension. I mean, I remember, I think it was mentioned in the opening remarks, where we are sitting right now, when the umbrellas came out in the park, that was a very interesting tension between how big are we going to make this building. And I believe, because I was actually, I'll have to make a confession, used to be a banker, no longer a banker. We were financing the Solomon Brothers Zuckerman construction of what I'll call Columbus Circle 1. And I think probably those umbrellas made a bigger impact than anything else I can possibly think of. It made people think twice.
I want to throw this out to everybody, and you can jump in if you have an opinion on this. We have a problem in this country with long-term decision-making because politicians are back for election so frequently that they like to make decisions that are popular in the moment. There's a sense in some of these answers that people actually would be tolerant of some increase in inconvenience, that they want to see the city built up for the future. I don't know whether they're willing to pay for it. That wasn't well addressed in the survey. But is there more of an appetite for investment and inconvenience than maybe politicians give New Yorkers credit for?
I think it depends on where you are and what the building is. I agree with you. I mean, I think on the whole, people are tolerant of new construction in the neighborhoods if it's a positive thing. People are tolerating a tremendous amount with respect to the 2nd Avenue subway, and merchants are obviously disturbed. But I think people in that community are certainly happy that it's happened.
In our community in Sunset Park, the community worked really hard to expand the median on 4th Avenue to make it more walkable and pedestrian friendly. And that development is an inconvenience for the community, but the community, I think, understands through our organizing efforts, we've learned that the community really understands that that means that there will be less accidents, less fatalities. They want the community to be more sustainable. So I think that when people in our community see an investment in infrastructure and see immediate results, that they're happy with that. I think it's when it takes a real long time and they don't see any traction, they don't see anything happening that they're benefiting from, that they become really frustrated.
I would agree with that. I think there's really sort of the pre and the post. The resistances and the complaints and the protests are very animated until the day the shovels go in the ground. And once the shovels are in the ground, I think people just put up with the inconvenience and realize they've at least had their say, and the process has worked or not worked so well. But once I worked on Times Square for I think it was almost 12 years, and there was a lot of controversy. But it was really when they started digging, the foundations went in, that it was real and people came on board.
Though I do think it's a participatory process is incredibly important. And there's a difference between an appearance of a participatory process and a process that has the ability to change the outcome. And people in New York know the difference and invest in those outcomes that they help to shape.
Can I add something to that? I really do think when we look at the changing demographics, the increase in the population, the issue of climate change, that it is more important than ever that we get communities meaningfully involved in decision making on a local level so that they have ownership, so that they know that they can drive transformation in their communities. And I think that's 4th Avenue, and I was talking about, is a perfect example of how the community was meaningfully engaged from the very beginning. And so when people they're more willing to put up with inconveniences because their outcomes are coming out of their thinking, their vision. So I do think it makes a difference, and I think it's a big mistake not to invest in communities' involvement at that level.
Ruth, you talked about the idea of an age-friendly New York, and Craig, you mentioned the idea of rethinking some traditional ideas and thinking out of the box a little bit. Are we moving in the direction you think we should be moving with these things, and is that backed up in the survey?
We are moving slowly in the direction I think we should be moving in, not fast enough for the urgency. The New York's population will be close to 20% over 60. Within 15 years, there'll be more old people in New York City than there are school children.
Is over 60 old?
No,
Thanks.
absolutely not. I'm 58 tomorrow. And being old is not a bad thing, is the other piece of that. But we're not conceptualizing the aging of the population as the opportunity for the city that it is. We're conceptualizing it still as a problem. And until we get it, that we are assets, we won't get it how we're going to be building an age-friendly city.
Craig, you got some big picture ideas on this.
Well, I think the fact is technology is viewed as one of the great ubiquitous solutions to everything. And when you it's not only above 60 and above, and I know there's some great work going on up at the Mailman School on gerontology and how we tap into this amazing pool of wisdom, experience, and all kinds of great things I think are going to come of that once we reconceptualize it. But keep in mind that for 30 and under, it's a different world. The millennials, I mean, I interact with them every day, and I walk out saying, wow, I barely understand. And it's just so intuitive. But I think technology is exponential. We are not going to stop it. We'll do the best we can to manage it. But when you talk about laws, mores, customs, traditions, they move, we'll use the word linearly. Some people use the word glacially. And I think that's very important. But how do we manage the gap? But the technology is not going to be the solution. It's going to be an enabler. But we have to make sure we're asking the right questions and solving the right problems.
We're down to about 3 minutes, so
There's a big
quick
problem.
response.
There's a very big problem that you mentioned briefly, and that is the inability to start early enough for very long-term projects. And if you take the most obvious in some ways, if you're thinking about it, it's sustainability, global warming, et cetera. We're behind now the things that will need to be in place in terms of infrastructure in 30 or 40 years.
You've done a lot with public-private partnerships. Is that an area where more can be done?
I think this is, essentially the public's responsibility. They need to be building large projects, whether it's, changing the subways or, deterring water in certain places. These things are going to take decades, and we haven't started.
Elizabeth, a final thought with a view to what message the political institutions need to get on this.
Well, first I want to say that it's absolutely necessary to build intergenerational relationships, and the city's also going to be more Latino, and it's going to be made up predominantly of people of African and indigenous ancestry at a time when the infrastructure is crumbling and things are getting worse. And we have to build communities that are resilient, and that requires a relationship across generations and across culture and class. So we have to bring a variety of stakeholders together to address this. I think Plan YC really laid a good foundation, and it's my hope that whoever becomes mayor next really builds on that and knows that a lot of the solutions are coming from communities, that they're coming from very local places, whether it's economic development, whether it's retaining manufacturing, and that our young people, because we keep talking about green jobs, and they really are these entry-level blue-collar jobs, that we need to think about these young people in our communities as the scientists, as the engineers, as the decision makers, as the educators, and that green jobs have to be multilateral. They can't just be entry-level blue-collar jobs. And that the challenges in our communities present us with the template that can provide them with their educational trajectory. And the opportunities for meaningful engagement can actually transform the landscape. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the problems are actually present us with the possibility for not only engaging them in a way that is positive and meaningful, but it's all very interdisciplinary. It all basically generates jobs in a lot of different ways and makes it possible for people to resolve problems that are very local. I hope that made sense.
It did make sense. Ruth, we're just wrapping up here, but I want to give you one chance to, do you have a message for the next mayor if we move to next year and have somebody else in City Hall?
The message for the next mayor is the people understand what we need, and we live in local neighborhoods and local communities who have the creative answers to our real lived daily lives.
Richard, I got 20 seconds for a final thought from you. I'm sorry to put you on the clock like that.
I think in terms of next mayor, my biggest concern, which is a narrow one now, has to do with education. There have been some excellent reforms started with Klein and Bloomberg, and there's a good reason to believe that they will be put into reverse in the next administration.
Craig?
Well, in the graduate, it's Benjamin, one word, plastics. My one word for this city or phrase would be 3D printing. We should become the 3D printing capital of the world. It is going to change everything.
Looking to the future is a good way to finish up. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Good discussion.
Fabulous. I never would have thought that.
Thank you.